Welcome to A Closer Look, where I take a deep dive into my latest videos and show you how to play my favorite parts of the song. This week, Tandem by Protest the Hero. With this first riff, there's a lot of 16th notes and a lot of syncopation. And for me, especially with this being a technical metal, very clean sound on the guitar, or very cleanly played on the guitar, you want to make sure that you're very in tempo, very in time. And what makes it easiest for me to do that is making sure my right hand, my picking hand, is always moving at a constant tempo, always moving at the 16th. And so what that means for the riff is that the low E notes, the low E chugs, are all played by upstrokes. They all start with upstrokes. And so that might sound a little weird because a lot of the times it's a lot more comfortable to start with downstrokes. And it usually is. That's usually true. But for me, it's more starting the phrase on a downstroke. And what that means for me is my hand's always moving. And so I'm going to really exaggerate my right hand so you can see what I mean. And so obviously that's not very clean because I'm just showing the strumming hand. But what that lets me do is I'm always in tempo. I'm always locked in with the drums. And obviously it takes a little more than just doing that to lock in. But it really pushes me along and really helps out with the way that I lock into the drums. And so this is what you just saw it, but here's what it'll look like in a little more realistic way with the right hand. It really just, my hand's always moving. It's not actually always moving, but I'm always ready with those upstrokes on the offbeats. And the other part of this the other half of the riff is that tapping part. And number one most important thing, to me at least, when playing these parts, because Protest the Hero's songs are full of them. It's one of the hardest things that they do. It's one of the hardest things that it took me to be able to learn these songs, is being able to be strumming something and go right into tapping. And the number one thing right off the bat that helps me out is that I tap with a finger that I'm not using the pick. I'm tapping with a finger that's not holding the pick. And so for me, that's my middle finger, but it could be any finger that, if you hold the pick differently, whatever you do, just a finger that's not on the pick so that it's always available to tap. And another thing that's important to know is, since you're going from strumming right into picking, it's important to remember, especially with a riff like this, that it's not palm muted, so you don't have to have your hand back here when you strum. And so I'm going to play this slowly because this isn't how I play the riff, but it's other parts of the song. I'll actually show one of the riffs later that I do this just because it gets your hand over there quicker, is that you can move your hand up here. I'm not palm muting, so I can just move my hand up here. Like I said, I don't practice it with this riff because I can make the jump. And that's something to practice being able to do. But if you can't make the jump, there's no shame in just picking up here. There's distortion on the guitar. The tone's not going to be very different. I'm not palm muting. I'm not giving up the palm mute. So knowing that you can move your hand up here, just a little bit, starting to move your hand, can really help get these licks cleaner. Knowing that that's an option is just something to always have in the front of your head. And another thing they're doing is they're hammering on from nowhere. And if you've never practiced this, it's just putting your finger down with enough force to get the note to sound. And that's how they change strings when they're tapping. And that's actually how I think everybody, at least me, everything that I do that changes strings while tapping, that's how I'm doing it. And it's really important. That's a really important skill to have. And to make it sound the cleanest, for me, I might make a whole video on this because there's a lot of info on this. But I'm muting all the higher strings with the meat of my first finger. And I'm muting the string immediately below the note that I'm playing with the tip of my finger. And once I get to higher strings where there's an extra string below that's open, I'm using my thumb, the meat of my thumb, or even my whole forearm to mute that string. So if I'm up here, This string, the A string, is muted by my first finger. And when I'm up here, low string is muted with my whole forearm. And being able and combining all that together, it gets you a really clean sound when you're changing strings with the tapping. And being able to do that can get you even through the other tapping parts of the song. And even tapping parts of other songs, or being able to do all sorts of things with tapping. And so there's a chance I might make an entire video on just that. But those few little things can really help you get through the little tapping parts in this riff. With this next riff, it was actually harder than the last for me to learn, because the little moments of silence, you really have to make the guitar silent. You really have to mute everything. But also, the reason I wanted to point this riff out was it actually contrasts the last riff in the way that I approach it. So for the last one, I wanted to make sure that my hand was always moving, to make sure that I could really lock in. And for me to lock in with this riff, I actually had to change it up a little bit. And I think that's pretty important, because comfort is the most important part of learning these riffs, of playing anything. And so if something might be correct or the proper way to play things, if it's not comfortable to you and it's easier to play it a different way, and you can still play cleanly, that's the most important part. That's the way you should play it. And so if the way that I explained the last riff isn't right for you, and there's a way that you can play it clean, play it that way if that's more comfortable. And so for this riff, starts on a downstroke on the downbeat, just like the last riff. And now the next part comes on the E of 3, right after 3. And even though there's quite a break there, quite a bit longer than the rests in the last riff, it still feels right for me to start it with an upstroke. And technically that's in line with the way I played the last riff. My hand is moving on the same grid always. And then the next measure comes, again, starts on a downstroke on the downbeat. But this is the part where I actually differ. So this part only has 1/16th note rest in between all the parts, which should line up with the way I played the last one. But it's not comfortable for me to play it at all. I was actually trying to practice the picking pattern as... I can't even do it now. I was trying to practice it. I cannot play it that way. I have to think of all those sections as all those three sections of two beats, sorry, as their own. Each one is their own thing. So I start each of them with a downstroke, and that way. It's just that's the way it's most comfortable for me. And you can play it any way you want. You can hybrid pick it. You can do it any way you want. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, is that just because one way seems like it should be the right answer and it doesn't feel right to you, just kind of play around with different stroking it different ways, and I'm sure it'll come out clean for you eventually if you can find what's comfortable. And another thing I think is cool about this riff is that this is the scurrilous twos of this song. Every song on this album it does that exact same rhythm somewhere. There's a riff somewhere in the song that does that same thing. Pretty much every song has 2 16th notes, 16th rest, 2 16th notes, 16th rest, and so on. And so this is where it does it in this song. I can't remember any of the other songs, but they're like there's stuff like that on every song, and I think that's really cool that they had a motif that they stuck with through the whole album. This riff was actually the hardest tapping part of the whole song for me. It's almost like a group of 7, and then it finishes out it's in 4/4, but it's a group of 7 notes, and then it loops around again. And to learn this, I had to take it very slow. And so the weird parts about this one, so it hammering on from nowhere, just like we saw before. But this time, we have to do a tap slide with our right hand. And all it takes, while you're muting everything the same way I talked about it earlier, just slide your tapping finger up 2 frets. And then you have to pull off to nothing. This is another weird part. The parts you're pulling off to are different than where they started. And then you tap on to nowhere with your left hand, and then it loops over again. To me, this is a very uncomfortable lick to play, but I just through practicing with a metronome, started as slow as I played it earlier. I was able to slowly pick up the tempo till I kind of felt the way that the groove to that tapping spot, the way that it felt, And the other thing that I'm doing is I have to use 2 different fingers for tapping because the whole lick ends on a tapped note. But it also starts on a tapped note. So I have to use... This is why I recommend using your middle finger as your main tapping finger, because if you have to switch, your third finger is also, like, for me at least, the third finger is also a pretty strong finger. Not the pinky. But the third finger is still a pretty strong finger. Even if you're not used to tapping, you can kind of feel how you get the power... How you can get power behind them, and just it's almost like a whole nother technique you have to learn. It's you just have to be able to get a feeling for what it feels like to tap with those fingers and how to play in time, switching between them. I would actually recommend doing exactly that, tapping that last note with your middle finger and the first note with your ring finger. And being able to play them at the speed you need to. Being able to switch back and forth between them like in the tempo of the song. And the other hard part of the song, not only is the tapping part difficult, but you end on a tap and go instantly into a strum note. But you don't have to come back here. Like I was talking about earlier, you can keep your pick up here and strum the note. And then you move back into position to keep playing the strummed parts. And this is what I was talking about earlier again. I have to come right in from 16th note strums right into a tap note. Luckily that they're scratches. Luckily it's not actual notes I have to hold. They're just scratches, but that actually is perfect for learning how to do this. That's something that I had to practice, and I think is a good technique to learn. And learning this riff on its own is helping bring all these things together to be able to play like Protest, which might be a series I might make, playing like Protest, that I go more in depth with techniques like these. And this riff really brings all those things that I talked about in that first riff and makes them even more extreme, because now you don't have a whole quarter note to rest on a note before you going back into picking. Everything is right next to each other. And it's just a difficult lick, and I think learning just this lick will help you immensely with any other difficult Protest the Hero lick. This riff is pretty nutty. And I think getting through it is almost like a two-part process. You got to be able to play the odd times. You got to be able to play through what the riff actually is. And then you have to be able to actually play the parts, the demanding parts, where you have to do the upstroke on the higher strings. And for starters, we'll look at the 16th note parts, where you have to jump up to the higher strings with upstrokes. And to practice this, for one, you could do the whole lick slow, the whole riff slow. And I'll just do the last part. And then, but that sometimes going slow, you get so much time to do that upstroke that it almost makes it's so easy that it doesn't get you faster. So you can just do one note on the E string, then do the upstroke on the higher strings. And what I'm doing is I'm really trying to hit that low string really lightly, and I'm almost angling my pick so that I can do an exaggerated pick and only hit an exaggerated stroke and only hit the E string. And since I'm exaggerating it so much, my pick's ending up here, and so I can just bring it back through and hit the chord. And so it's almost like you could practice doing this, just strumming how you would. Because you have your left hand here to meet the strings. So you can, because I can strum the 16th notes at this speed. And now all I gotta do is hit the right strings on the upstroke. And now I don't have to exaggerate so much. And another way to do this is just strum straight 16th notes at the tempo you want to go, and so the notes come on the E after the beat. 1 E and a 2 E and a. So just do it after beat 1. So 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. Then do it on 1 and 4. So then there's a little bit of a break, and then do it 1, 2, 3, 4. So it'll sound like this. And you can do that at whatever tempo, preferably up to tempo, so you only are thinking about that string change, which I think is actually pretty difficult. I know the second part of getting through this riff is being able to navigate the odd time signatures. And the way that makes it easiest for me to do that is just, it takes some memorizing, which you have to do anyway to learn it, but memorizing how many 16th notes you're playing, because it's odd time through 8th notes, but you're doing those 16th note licks, which always leads you on downstrokes. Every beat's downstroke, so you have the dotted 8th part, which is always the same, and it's just whatever the 16th note part is. So it starts out with this, which is just which if you break that down even further, it does the same thing twice, and now it loops that. Now put them together, and now you're back to the top. And that's actually that measure happens. That's the first measure, and then it has a first ending, we'll call it, and then it repeats and does that first measure again and does a second ending. And the first and second ending are very similar. They both revolve around the same idea of the lick I was practicing earlier. The second ending ends with exactly that. It just does that 5 times. And the first inning though, that's where it's a little weird because it's that same lick, but it ends it early. It ends on the upstroke. And all you got to do is just get a feel for that in your hands. If you can't get a feel for the groove of that song, because it's just hitting those hits with you, it's just hitting those dotted eighth notes, and then it hits the high notes. So there's not really a groove there. You just have to memorize where it is in the pattern, and have a feel for the way that your pick goes, like that the way that the notes run together, rather than the feel of the section as a whole. This last section is pretty darn weird if you ask me. The beginning is pretty straightforward. Just a little, I use sweep picking, these little descending arpeggio line, where I do a downstroke on the G string and upstroke through the D and A strings, and then I do a hammer on the last two notes on the G string. So it'll if you look for that in my hands, it'll look like this. And the other part is the rhythmic part after that. That's the weirdest part. Now, when I was looking at this, I was like, man, I just can't get a feel for I cannot understand what's going on here. I could read it off the page, and it just was not clicking. I could not memorize it. And what I noticed, though, after looking at it, is that what they call it is a musical palindrome, rhythmic palindrome. The first measure and the second measure, I guess, is the first measure flipped around. And so that's a start. But it's still so much to memorize. I couldn't, it was so much memorizing, I couldn't really get a feel for what it was meant to be. But what really clicked for me was when I realized that it's actually just two sections. I'm going to call them two sections that split each measure in two. And I'm going to call it A. And what A was one 16th note, 16th note rest, two 16th notes, 16th rest, two 16th notes, 16th rest, 16th note, 16th rest. And so what I thought, to me, that looked 1, 2, 2, 1. And the B section was almost like the opposite of that. It was two 16th notes, then a rest, then one rest, 2 rest, 2, 1, 1, 2. So the measures, that first measure turned out to be 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. And the second measure is just the opposite of that. It just does what I'll call B then A. 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1. And boom, it was, once I realized that section became way easier. So together it just sounds like this. And thinking of it in those smaller chunks really made it just so much easier. Made it a breeze to get through. And that's just if you're having trouble memorizing weird rhythmic parts, just kind of pull back, look at more of it, look at less of it till you can find a pattern. And once you can find the pattern of the whole thing, it really just makes everything way easier to learn. This has been a closer look at what I think are some of the hardest spots in Tandem. And so I hope this helped you learn the song a little better. And yeah, thanks for watching. You know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. See you next week.